If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the U.S., just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago, many, many decades ago, and makes no sense. It's so perfect as a great and cherished state.
Donald Trump's aggressive policy to add Canada to the 51 states has led to the possibility that Canada could become the 28th country in the European Union. So how realistic is this scenario, and how will it affect the world and the US economy? Well, let's see. The geography challenge. Can Canada really be part of the EU? How far is Canada from Europe? One of the first hurdles anyone thinks about when discussing Canada joining the EU is geography. Let's get this out of the way. Canada is not in Europe, but is this geographical gap really as big a deal as we imagine? Not necessarily. If we look at the global map, Canada's northernmost point, Cape Columbia, is only around 2,400 kilometers from Norgum in Finland. That's about the same distance as the drive from New York to California. This proximity might surprise you, especially considering the way most people think about Canada's distance from Europe. Moreover, flights from Montreal to Lisbon take about 6.5 hours, comparable to flying from Helsinki to Lisbon. When we add European territories like Greenland, Iceland, and the UK into the equation, the geographical distance between Canada and Europe doesn't seem so insurmountable anymore. Sure, Canada is not in Europe, but it's not that far away. Its physical closeness to the continent could potentially ease the challenges of trade, movement, and logistics within the European Union. Canada's size and the EU's geography. Another major factor would be the sheer size of Canada in comparison to the EU. If Canada were to join, it would instantly become the largest EU member by landmass, far outstripping France, the current leader. With over 10 million square kilometers, 3.8 million square miles, Canada is more than double the size of the current European Union, which would triple the EU's territory. This would come with significant implications for things like defense, resources, and governance. While Canada's massive size would offer strategic advantages, it would also create complexities. Just imagine managing such a vast area with the existing EU's policies on trade, agriculture, or even migration. But on the other hand, with an area that large, Canada could bring a significant amount of natural resources and geopolitical weight to the table. The EU's Copenhagen criteria and Canada's qualification. What does the EU require for new members? Now, let's dive deeper into the question of whether Canada could even qualify to join the EU. The European Union's criteria for new members are outlined in the Copenhagen criteria, which set out the requirements for any country hoping to join. These include democratic institutions, a market economy, and the ability to comply with EU laws and regulations. Interestingly, these criteria do not specifically require a country to be geographically located in Europe. While Canada obviously doesn't sit on the European continent, the EU's Article 49 only states that a candidate must be a European state. The problem is, there's no clear definition of what qualifies as a European state. The term is open to interpretation, and here lies the opportunity for Canada. Given the country's strong historical, cultural, and political ties to Europe, the case for Canada as a European state becomes more plausible. Could its European heritage, derived from its French and British colonial past, be enough to qualify? Cultural ties between Canada and Europe. Canada's cultural roots are deeply embedded in European history, particularly from Western Europe. The French influence is especially strong, particularly in Quebec, where the French language and traditions are an integral part of the local identity. But Canada also has deep ties to Britain. Its monarch is still the Queen of England, and Canada's political system is modeled on the Westminster style of parliamentary democracy. These strong European connections are vital when considering whether Canada could blend into European society. In fact, Canada's relationship with Europe is more than just historical. French is one of the 2 official languages of Canada, and the country's political system closely mirrors that of the EU. If you drop someone in Montreal or Quebec City, they could easily mistake it for a European city. The French influence in Quebec has shaped Canada in ways that bring it closer to Europe than to its North American neighbor, the United States. Moreover, Canada joined World War I and II alongside European nations, partly due to its ties with the British Empire. This long-standing commitment to Europe shows that the cultural and political alignment between Canada and European countries runs deep. Defense complications. Canada's role in NATO and EU security. The complicated relationship between NATO and the EU, one of the biggest hurdles for Canada joining the EU would be defense. Most EU countries are also members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which ensures collective defense among member states. The challenge here is that Canada is already a member of NATO, and NATO and the EU are separate institutions despite having overlapping memberships. If Canada were to join the EU, it would be another member of both organizations, but the situation would get more complicated in the context of the growing skepticism within the United States about NATO's role. What if the US were to withdraw from NATO, or even worse, refuse to support the Mutual Defense Clause if another NATO country were attacked? This is a real concern, particularly given the instability of the current political climate in the US under Trump. What would a joint European military mean for Canada? This brings up an interesting question. If the EU continues to develop its own military capabilities, how would Canada fit in? French President Emmanuel Macron has already suggested the possibility of a European army, and this idea has been gaining momentum in recent years due to growing security concerns in Europe, particularly related to Russia. If the EU were to move towards a single unified military force, Canada could be required to commit some of its forces to Brussels control. Would Canada agree to that? It's a question of sovereignty versus collective security. While Canada is already involved in NATO operations, having its military forces under the EU's umbrella would represent a fundamental shift in Canada's foreign policy. This could be a deal breaker for many Canadians, and it would certainly be a major hurdle in the path to EU membership. Economic impacts. The trade war and Canada's economic future. The economic realities of joining the EU. Canada's economic relationship with Europe is already significant. The European Union is Canada's 3rd largest trading partner, and Canada has a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU in place. However, if Canada were to join the EU, it would become part of the single European market, opening up new trading opportunities, particularly in sectors like energy, technology, and natural resources. Canada's $2.2 trillion economy would make it the 4th largest EU member by GDP. This could significantly bolster the EU's global economic standing, especially in a world where trade relations are increasingly volatile. But let's not forget, Canada's primary trading partner remains the United States, and this is where things get tricky. The US-Canada trade relationship, over 77% of Canada's exports go to the United States, which is a vital part of the economy. The US-Canada relationship is so deeply intertwined that even a suggestion of Canada joining the EU would raise questions about how this could affect trade dynamics with the US. If the Trump administration or future US governments place more tariffs or impose additional barriers, Canada would need alternative trade arrangements. In that case, joining the EU might be a way to ensure continued access to global markets and a more diversified trade network. However, joining the EU could also lead to complications. For example, the UK, which remains an important Canadian trading partner, left the EU. Would Canada's access to the UK be hindered in the EU, given the complexities of post-Brexit trade. These are questions that would need to be addressed early in the negotiation process. The political and legal hurdles navigating the EU's membership process. The process for joining the EU is not simple. First, Canada would need the unanimous approval of all 27 existing EU member states. That's a tall order, considering that many European nations have protectionist policies that prioritize their own industries over foreign competition. Additionally, there is the issue of Canadian exports potentially disrupting European markets. For instance, several EU countries have yet to fully ratify the 2017 trade agreement between Canada and the EU, a clear sign of how contentious trade can be within the Union. And even if the EU were open to Canadian membership, the negotiation process would be long and complex. It could take years, if not decades, for Canada to align its policies, laws, and standards with EU requirements. The EU has strict regulations in areas such as environmental protection, labor laws, and agricultural standards, all of which would require significant adjustments on Canada's part.